Hello, and thank you for watching my IS Symposium presentation. My name is Hannah Groetsch. I'm a political science major, English minor, and for my IS project, I examined whether more women participating in presidential primary debates leads to more discussion of women's issues in those debates. So in 1972, Shirley Chisholm, there on the top left, became the first woman to participate in a presidential primary debate, and during that debate, on multiple occasions, she really had to justify her presence in the race as a black woman. Since then, only 10 other women candidates have appeared in presidential primary debates, and 6 of those women were all from the 2020 debate cycle. So in the top row after Shirley Chisholm, in order from left to right, we have Carol Moseley Braun, who ran in 2004, Hillary Clinton in 2008 and 2016, Michelle Bachmann in 2012, and Carly Fiorina in 2016. And then the bottom row is all candidates who ran in 2020, and from left to right we have Tulsi Gabbard, Kirsten Gillibrand, Kamala Harris, Amy Klobuchar, Marianne Williamson, and Elizabeth Warren, all of whom, with the exception of Bachmann and Fiorina, were Democrats who appeared in Democratic primary debates that I will be examining in this study. And I was really interested in the 6 women running in 2020 and what impacts multiple women appearing in a debate might have had, in large part because during my sophomore year I took a class called Women, Power, and Politics with Professor Boss, and we talked a lot about the impacts that women running for or serving in government can have. And throughout the class, we also talked a lot about how women are often able to turn their descriptive representation into substantive representation. So descriptive representation is when candidates or representatives share a common identity with their constituents, or in the words of Hannah Pitkin, they stand for others. So for example, as a woman, Kamala Harris descriptively represents me as a woman. Whereas substantive representation is acting in the interests of a specific group or acting for others. So in this example, Kamala Harris would substantively represent me as a woman if she, say, helped advocate for a bill that would narrow the pay gap. And the political science literature indicates that women can turn their identities as women, this descriptive representation, into substantive action by doing things like advocating for policies that benefit women, getting women's issues on the agenda, increasing women's political advocacy or engagement, and helping change the institutions they're part of to be more women-friendly. And oftentimes they're better at doing all of this than their male counterparts. And because of this, more women in office can therefore lead to better substantive representation, better representation for women. But most of this research focuses on legislatures because until recently there just weren't enough women at higher executive levels of office. And as we just saw in that previous slide, it was impossible to see the impacts of increased descriptive representation in presidential primary debates until 2020, when there were multiple women running against each other. And so I was really interested in trying to start to fill that big gap in the literature. And with that in mind, I asked the following research question. Does the presence of women in a presidential primary debate impact the prevalence of women's issues? And in asking this question, I'm examining substantive representation by looking at women's issues, given that the action candidates can take in a debate is basically what they choose to talk about. So if women candidates prioritize talking about women's issues, that would help provide more representation to women. But at this point, you may be starting to ask, what is a women's issue? What issues count? Which is a good question given that there's disagreement on it. Women's issues are not a perfectly defined category. Different scholars use slightly different definitions depending on what they're looking at. And there's also some debate about whether women's issues are inclusive enough or whether they're essentializing, things like that. But in my paper, I used a general definition from Michelle Swers's research that women's issues are, quote, issues that are particularly salient to women because they seek to achieve equality for women, they address women's special needs, such as women's health concerns or childcare, or they confront issues with which women have traditionally been concerned in their role as caregivers, end quote. And then within that, I used Jason Trucote and Newly Paul's framework from their 2015 research, which defines women's issues into kind of 2 big camps based on how directly related they are to women's interests and identity. And those are manifest and latent women's issues. So manifest women's issues are issues that are the most salient to women and specifically impact women. So for instance, the pay gap or reproductive rights. Whereas latent issues are still in the interests of women, but they're not quite as salient or directly related. And these issues are often based on public opinion polling that shows gender gaps in the levels of support on various issues like welfare or education. With all that in mind, I ended up with 4 hypotheses. For my first hypothesis, H1, I expected that across all the debate cycles I was looking at, that women's issues would be more prevalent in debates with more women participating, so that the debates with multiple women would have a higher proportion of women's issues than the debates with one woman or no women participating. And I thought that this would especially be the case for manifest women's issues, since they're the most closely tied to women and their identities, and therefore also the most closely tied to the women candidates on stage. For my second hypothesis, I expected that women's issues, specifically just within the 2020 debate cycle, would increase as the number of women candidates increased. So the 2020 debate cycle had debates with 2, 3, and 4 women participating. So in this case, I expected that the debates with 4 women would have a higher proportion of women's issues than the debates with 2 or 3 women. And again, I thought that this would be especially the case for manifest issues. I also expected that women's issues would increase when more critical actors were on stage, which Sarah Childs and Mona Lina Crook define as basically people who are very dedicated to taking action on women's issues. And so if there were more of them in debates, there would also be more women's issues. My third hypothesis was based on research that indicates that men may change their behavior when campaigning against a woman in order to try to appeal to women voters more. And so I predicted that men candidates would talk about women's issues more often in debates with multiple women as compared to debates with just one woman. And for this hypothesis, I looked at Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders, who both ran against just one woman, Hillary Clinton, in 2008 and 2016 respectively, and then obviously both of them ran against all the women from 2020. And then finally, for my fourth hypothesis, this was based on Trucote and Paul's 2015 research that found that women moderators asked more questions with manifest issues than their male counterparts. And so I wanted to see if this also held true within the 2020 debates. And so I hypothesized that in the 2020 debate cycle, women moderators would ask more questions with manifest issues than the men moderators that were with them. And so essentially for all 4 of these hypotheses, the common thread is that more women candidates on stage, or moderators being women in general, would lead to more women's issues in the debates, and especially more manifest issues. To test these hypotheses, I conducted an automated content analysis on Democratic primary debate transcripts from 2000, 2004, 2008, 2016, and 2020. I only looked at Democratic primary debates because no Republican women have run against each other, which makes it impossible to look at increasing levels of descriptive representation amongst Republican women. The debate Shirley Chisholm was in doesn't have a great transcript, and she also ran quite a while ago, so I didn't look at the 1972 debate cycle, and instead I started with the 2000 debates, since 2000 and the latter half of 2004, after Carol Moseley Braun dropped out, are the most recent debates in which 0 women were participating, and so I started there so I could compare to having 0 women in a debate. And then the remaining debates from the other cycles all have either 1 or multiple women. So I ran these transcripts through a software called NVivo, which coded them for manifest and latent women's issues based on my code book of words that I made. For manifest issues, I coded for categories of reproductive rights, women's equality, childcare, violence against women, equal pay, and then pregnancy and family planning. And for latent issues, I coded for the categories of healthcare, elder care, gun control, education, welfare, environment, LGBTQ+, race and ethnicity, immigration, and human rights. And those categories largely come from Trucote and Paul's research. And within each category, I came up with a very long list of words or short phrases that candidates were likely to use when talking about the issue. So example, for the category of reproductive rights, I included words like abortion, Planned Parenthood, and Roe, as in Roe versus Wade. And once the transcripts were coded, I ended up with a total number of manifest issue words, latent issue words, and then the total number of all women's issues combined. And I divided those numbers by the number of words in whatever transcript I was looking at so that I could get a proportion that I could then compare between debates of vastly different lengths. And I also use those proportions to use a two-sample t-test to see if my data was significant. And the results show that my first hypothesis was partially supported. So women's issues overall didn't increase like I hypothesized they would, but there was a statistically significant increase in the proportion of manifest women's issues when there were more women on stage. And so if you look at those first three bars there on the bar graph, that's manifest issues. And you can see how much taller that orange bar is when there's more women running than the other two. And so manifest women's issues increased 150% and 233% between 0 women and 1 woman on stage, and then more than 1 woman. And the other interesting thing about these results is that latent issues really didn't fit the pattern I was expecting. There were the most latent women's issues in the debates where there were 0 women participating. And so this might be just because latent women's issues are very close to the Democratic Party's issues anyway, and so gender doesn't really have an impact. Or it could be the specific circumstances of the 2000 election when there were no women running. Similarly, my second hypothesis was partially supported. For this hypothesis, I was looking just within the 2020 debate cycle, and while women's issues overall did not increase, there was a statistically significant increase in the proportion of manifest women's issues when there were 4 women on stage as candidates compared to 2 or 3 women. And you can again see that in that first orange bar in the bar graph on the left, how much higher it is than the other 2. For this hypothesis, I was also looking at the presence of critical actors, those individual candidates that have really large impact and are really dedicated to women's issues. And so I broke down in the bar graph on the right all of the 2020 debates by the proportion of women's issues in the debates, and then looked to see if there were critical actors that were really responsible for high levels of those manifest issues. And so the candidates' names on that graph are those who served as critical actors. So in that second bar there, Gillibrand was a critical actor. She was responsible for 35% of all the manifest issues in that debate. The bar labeled Warren, she was responsible for 25% of the manifest issues in that debate. Harris also served as a critical actor. She was also, at multiple points in the debate, really focused on Black women's issues specifically. And something else I was really interested in when I ended up breaking the manifest women's issues down and looking at them in each debate was that the debate with the highest proportion of women's issues, that bar right in the middle, right next to the bar labeled Warren, is a debate that had not only 4 women participating as candidates, but also had 4 women moderators moderating that debate. So the debate with the highest proportion of manifest women's issues actually had 8 women involved in the debate. My third hypothesis was also partially supported. Bernie Sanders talked about both manifest and latent women's issues more in 2020 when he was debating multiple women as compared to 2016 when he was just debating Clinton. But this was not the case for Joe Biden. No type of women's issue increased for him, and so out of the 2 men I looked at, essentially it was split down the middle where one supported my hypothesis, one didn't. And I, in my conclusion, kind of attributed this mostly to ideological differences between those 2 candidates. For instance, Sanders talked a lot more about paid family leave, which is a women's issue, and so that might be the reason there. For my fourth hypothesis, however, it is fully supported in that women moderators asked 3 times as many questions as their male counterparts. I didn't go into this research all that focused on the moderators, but that was a really interesting and exciting result for me, especially given that over the course of the full debate cycle, basically an equal number of men and women were moderators, and men moderators actually asked more questions and said more words. And so the fact that women talked that much more about manifest women's issues really highlights the role that moderator gender can play. And furthermore, that all-women moderating panel I was talking about in that last slide, that's a picture of them right there on the right. But 42% of all questions with manifest issues came from that one debate where they were moderating, which was also really interesting to me. And so overall, my results for my fourth hypothesis match Groetsch and Paul's results and shows that moderator gender can impact what is discussed. So in conclusion, women candidates and moderators matter. My research shows multiple instances of statistically significant increases in manifest women's issues when more women are on stage, meaning that without women's presence there would have been fewer conversations about manifest women's issues and thus worse representation for women. It also signals that manifest issues rather than latent issues may be the better benchmark for measuring women's issues going forward, given that latent issues are just so closely tied to the issues the Democratic Party discusses anyways. This could be a great place for future research, especially in seeing if Republican women's presence in debates would potentially increase latent issues as well as potentially manifest women's issues. There's lots of opportunity for future research as well, looking at the impacts of women of color running at higher levels of office, as well as what happens when women's descriptive representation increases at higher levels of office more generally. That debate where 8 women were either moderating or participating as candidates did have the highest proportion of manifest issues, and so it would be really interesting to see what happens regarding manifest women's issues as more women continue to run for the presidency in greater numbers. So in sum, my research shows that women can turn their descriptive representation into substantive representation at these higher levels of office, and so that having more women on stage isn't just pandering to women. It has a quantifiable impact and is correlated in certain instances with more discussions of manifest women's issues. I'd like to conclude by thanking Professor Boss for her guidance during this project and over the past few years, my fellow advisees, and to you for learning about my research. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the chat, or feel free to email me at hgretch22@worcester.edu. Thank you.